Welcome, everybody. Today we are excited to have Rajat Saxena present their work, Rapid Learning of New Items Using Similarity-Weighted Interleaved Learning, or SWIL. Rajat is a neuroscience PhD student from the University of California, Irvine. We are in for a special treat today to hear from the neuroscience perspective. I actually took a few neuroscience classes here at Georgia Tech, and I have a lot of respect and admiration for everything you have to remember in your field. So go ahead, take it away, Rajat.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Hi, everyone. How's it going? First of all, I would like to thank James and the Continual AI organization for inviting me to present my work, my friend Keelan for coordinating this. My name is Rajat. I'm a fifth year grad student in neuroscience department here at University of California, Irvine. And I'm going to be talking about how you can make neural network, how we as humans learn new information rapidly, what goes on in our brain during sleep, and how we can use that information to sort of train neural networks to learn new items faster. And we've developed this algorithm called similarity-weighted interleave learning for neural networks, and we're also testing it in real brains, recording from mice. So the talk is going to be structured in two different parts. First is going to be the computational work, this work done using neural networks, and this is a published paper in PNAS that you can go look at. And then the second part is going to be rodent electrophysiology results, the experiment work that I've been doing to test the SWIL algorithm in behaving animals. So usually I like to acknowledge people that have helped me with all the work. I would like to thank my PI, Dr. Bruce McNaughton, and my lab mates, fellow lab mates, Dr. Shob, Dr. Kiliansky, and Dr. Navratilova, and all of the funding agencies. So with that, let us get into it. Um, okay, so here's me doing all kind of different things, climbing, playing my guitar, skiing, so on, dancing. And as humans, we are capable of learning continuously from stream of data, building on what was learned previously. If you know how to play, say, tennis, it would be really easy for you to transfer that skill to play squash, or any other racket sports. As well as we can keep learning on new things without forgetting what was previously learned. So this capability is what is called as continual learning, and that's like the goal for um, a lot of the neural network, a lot of the convolutional neural network field, machine learning field. And it's also interesting for us as a neuroscientist, that how does brain accomplish this task, because there's so many unknowns about that. So that is the goal of my thesis. Personally, I am interested in understanding both from a brain perspective and using ideas from neuroscience research and implement them in neural network. So one thing at the end of the talk, I would really appreciate if, as other as computer scientists, if you guys would have any insights for me as a neuroscience, that, oh, these experiments would be really cool to run, or can you try this thing, so that it can help, we can have a nice crosstalk between both of the fields. All right, so let's get into it. So let's imagine a system where this agent sort of knows about what's a bird. A bird has wings, it can move, it can fly. And then the network is, this agent or this network is presented with a new example of a bird, which is penguin. That's a bird which can move, has wings, but cannot fly. And this sort of inconsistent information, if you try to train a neural network, an artificial neural network on this second task of penguin, the neural network tend to forget what was previously learned. And this is what we call catastrophic interference. Now, this example of penguin can be learned on the fly by real brains. But clearly, a lot of studies have shown that neural networks suffer from this problem of catastrophic interference of forgetting. So what's going on? How does our brain overcome this barrier? And one of the ideas that was proposed in the field was this hypothesis called complementary learning systems theory. And the idea was our brain has two different learning systems. One's this fast learning system, which is mostly driven by hippocampus, and then there is the slow learning system that's driven by neocortex. So what happens is during offline period such as sleep or awake rest. Hippocampus triggers a replay of new memories. So all this new information about penguins get replayed in the cortex, and then cortex spontaneously replays all the old memories. And this joint replay of new and old allows us to learn new information without forgetting um, the previously learned knowledge. And this was a hypothesis proposed in 1995, and there have been some experimental research to show that this kind of joint replay happens. But back then, the authors were like, okay, it's really hard to do this sort of experiments in rodents because of the technology being not that advanced at the moment. So what they did was they showed that, okay, if you were to take a neural network and train them to learn a new information, now what you can do is you can do this sort of joint replay, which is what we call interleave, which is what they call interleave, or something called as focused replay, which is just the presentation of new item alone. So when you do that, just the presentation of new item alone, this focused learning, you can learn the new information much faster. But then what that does is it causes the neural network to forget about the existing memory. So there's a lot of interference. But interleave learning, on the other hand, or the joint replay, where you present the new and old item in mix at equal probability, the new item learning is relatively slower, but you also don't forget the previously learned information. So this joint learning or interleaved learning helped overcome catastrophic interference in neural network. Now, there's a problem with the way this theory was proposed, and which is that there simply is not enough time, no matter how long you sleep, to interleave everything. So the way the theory was proposed is every time you go to sleep or every time you learn a new information, you have to replay all the new and all the old information. And that seems very time consuming and inefficient. So what we proposed is maybe you don't really need to interleave the entire training set. It may be sufficient to interleave only items with substantial representational similarity to the new item. This is what we called similarity-weighted interleave learning, or SWIL. So just to give one of the intuition that we came up with the idea, one of the things we noticed while doing this very simple neural network kind of learning was, imagine the same bird example that I talked about, where birds have wings and fly and can move and can fly. Now if you present the network with a class that is very consistent, so a different bird, say a sparrow, that has wings, can fly, can move, so very consistent item there, you notice that you can learn that information faster, and it causes relatively less interference with the existing class. So there was some. On the other hand, if you take the example of penguin, now it's relatively slower to learn, and there was a lot of interference with the existing class. So we were noticing this sort of gradient of interference based on how consistent a new item was with previously learned classes. And this sort of indicated that, maybe there is something about the similarity or the consistency of the new item being presented uh, that can make a network learn faster and also retain the previously learned information. So that was one of the hints for the similarity weighted interleave learning. So let's see. So just to uh, more formalize the idea, imagine you have an agent that knows about all these different classes, electronic devices, TVs, plant, birds, animals, and so on. And now you want to add a new information. So you want to add this penguin information that's hippocampus driven. So our hypothesis was, when the new items are being added, the old items need to be interleaved in proportion to to their representational similarity with the new. So when you want to learn about penguin, maybe you don't need to replay information about electronic devices or plants, because there's no way you're going to look at a TV and go like that's a penguin, or there's no way you're going to look at a car and go like that's a penguin. But there is a chance where you might confuse penguin with other bird and so on. So with that, uh, there was this beautiful work published by J. McClellan's group in 2020. What they did was they took a very simple data set with birds, with some birds, fish, plant, and so on. And then they trained the network to learn a new class called Sparrow-Hawk, which has some properties of Sparrow and some property of Hawk. And in the first scenario, so the first row basically is the joint replay, where you're replaying all the new information, all the old information combined. There you get a nice learning and not a lot of forgetting with the existing classes. So this is going to be a control case. But then they took similarity weighted learning, which is shown in the second row down here, where they presented a lot of sparrowhawk examples, so a lot of new examples, a little bit of bird example, and then fewer example of fish and plant. And when they did that, they still saw similar learning curve as the fully interleave or the joint replay condition. And but with much fewer number of item presented. So what that sort of indicated, when you scale the learning curve, which is shown here um, in the last column, when you scale this learning curve in terms of the item presented or patterns presented per epoch, there was a speed up notice that you could present 2.5x fewer items and still get similar learning. And that to us was very interesting, because that really will we were hoping that this scales a lot when it comes to brain, where you've stored so many categories. Because so we wanted to take this thought and explore it much more with complex neural networks, with like nonlinear convolutional neural network, many more classes and so on, because this was a very simple data set which was built by us. We already knew what the similarity were and so on. So then came the work that got published in PNAS, where the general idea is you take a neural network, you train this network to know about n certain number of classes, pre-trained to say 90% accuracy. Then a new class is being presented, and you compute the similarity of the new class with the old classes. And the similarity calculation can be done with, we used the different types of you can use either a cosine similarity, you can use a canonical cross correlation, the CCA kind of analysis. And the similarity was usually computed at the penultimate layer, because that is where the maximum differentiation is present in terms of the activations of new and the old class. So we compute this sort of similarity matrix. And from there, we had 5 different cases in which the network was tested. The first case is focused learning, where you're only presenting, you're retraining the network by presenting only the new class item. The second case is fully interleaved learning, or FIL, where you're presenting the new class item, which is the penguin, and then all of the old class item. And then the third case is SWIL, where you're presenting new class item, but then the old class items are weighted according to their similarity. And then finally, we had 2 test cases. The first case was partially interleaved learning, where we were presenting the new class item and old class item, same as fully interleaved. So all of them are presented as equal probability, but the total number of classes were balanced between PIL, partial interleave, and similarity interleave. And I'll explain this in the next slide, which will make it more clear. And then the third scenario was equally weighted interleaved learning, which was again a control where we presented the new class item, but then the old class item were, rather than weighted according to similarity, they were just weighted equally. So just to deep dive on it, so focus learning is you're only retraining with new class, which is shown here in golden. Fully interleaved learning, you're retraining with the entire data set, and each class is presented with new and old classes. They're all presented with equal probability. Partial interleaved learning, you're retraining with a subset of data sets. So the total number of classes is 3. Total number of image presented are 350 rather than 54,000. And there's equal probability for each class. Then comes SWIL, where you have the new class being presented, which is shown in golden, and then the old classes are weighted according to similarity. And then equally weighted interleaved learning, where you're retraining with, so the number of new class example between SWIL and equal weighted or equal are same, but the old classes are now weighted equally rather than according to similarity. So note that there is the total number of images used for PIL, SWIL, and equal are exactly same. So these are our so the partial interleaved learning and equal weighted interleaved learning are our two control cases. So one of the first thing we notice, obviously, which is very clear, that similarity responds to corresponds very strongly to the confusion matrix. So if you sort of compute uh, like cosine similarity between the activation of shirt, you'll notice that it's super similar to t-shirt and a pullover and a coat. And same thing for boot, it's similar to sandals and sneaker, but not to the other um, uh, apparel. And the same thing you will notice if you look at the confusion matrix, there's a higher chance for you to confuse between boot and sneaker images than boot and shirt, and then shirt being getting confused with t-shirt. So the similarity, so we knew that our similarity matrix is actually capturing a nice learning dynamics of the neural network. So with that, we went ahead and we trained our network on 8 classes of the CIFAR 10 data set. So we trained the network on plane, birds, and so on, everything except the cat and car. We trained the network on 8 of these classes, and then we presented the network with the new cat class, again in all these 5 conditions, and focus learning, fully interleaved, and so on. And you can clearly see with similarity weighted, the cat class, there was higher similarity with the dog, which is shown here in green, and other animal classes, and so on. So when we did that, what we noticed, so over here in the first column, you can see the learning of the new class. So the pink, which is SWIL, is kind of hidden behind yellow. So SWIL allowed us to learn the new cat class much faster in fewer epochs and with much fewer number of image being presented, as compared to fully interleaved learning, which is shown here in blue. And now one can say, oh, look, equally weighted interleave learning has exact same performance or comparable performance as SWIL. But then the difference comes in the recall or the performance of the similar old classes. Now, these similar old and different old classes were determined using looking at the hierarchical clustering on the applying the hierarchical clustering on the activation of these old class and the new class. And so in this, for the cat example, the similar old classes would be the animal, all the other animal classes, and the different old classes would be vehicles such as ship, truck, and plane. So with equally weighted interleave learning, you can clearly see there is a higher interference. So there is some benefit of this similarity weighted, where it is preserving, where SWIL is sort of allowing you to learn new information much faster and as good a performance as fully interleave learning, and it is giving you comparable performance on the previously learned classes, which and it kind of overcomes all the issues of equally weighted interleave learning, which is shown here, the better performance in similar old classes, and the issue with the partial interleave learning, where partial interleave learning was does not reach the same level of accuracy and is also taking much more epochs. So the point is, with SWIL, we could get we could reach sort of saturation accuracy much faster, and while using much smaller number of items being presented. So if you scale these curves as a function of number of items presented, you'll see a lot of speed up, which is so so that was the thing. We took this algorithm, we tested it with simple linear, like one hidden layer, deep linear network, convolutional neural network with CIFAR 10, CIFAR 100, VGG 19, and so on. And over here, what I've shown is the comparison between SWIL and fully interleaved learning as a function of number of image presented. And you can clearly appreciate how SWIL allows you to reach the same performance on the new items as fully interleaved, but using far fewer number of items or images being presented. And we have tested this with different standard data sets and new architecture, and we get pretty comparable result, and it works really well. Okay, so next thing we wanted to just to deep dive into the idea of this speed up and how that sort of relates with the how that relates with the number of non-overlapping item. So there are a couple of ways to go about seeing that, is it really, is this speed up because of this idea of, you know, um, there being less overlap between um, the new class and the previously learned classes, or how close can we get to modeling some of the ideas from neuroscience? So there are a couple of ways of doing that. Uh, First way was you could take a neural network and stop its learning at different level of stages where, the distance between class representation, which is shown here for different classes from CIFAR. Um, so we took a VGG network and trained the network on CIFAR 100 data set. Um, and then we presented the train. So we presented the network with the train class, and we looked at sort of the representation of train class and how it overlaps with other vehicle classes from the CFAR 100 data set. And what we did was we stopped the network at three different stages of learning. Um, you can stop it early when there is less differentiation, so performance kind of lower, and then and further on where at the last point where the network's performing really well and there's much more separation between the representation, and as a result, less confusion and so on. Or the second approach where you can take a network, you can take three different networks with different level of complexity, and they would allow, they give you different performance. So the idea was, can we change the overlap between the new class being presented and the previously learned classes? And does that correlate with the speed up that you observe in learning? And clearly what we saw was, as the distance between the new and the old class clusters increased, the amount of speed up that you see kind of increased linearly, not exactly linear, but linear. And now think of it from a point of view of brain where you know many more classes, many more multimodal information. You have auditory, you have visual, you have tactile. There might be much less overlap. So anytime you're presented a visual information, you don't need to replay anything about the auditory or the tactile or the smell related information. In that case, you will have to present much smaller number of the old class item, and the speed up that you will observe for learning a new item might be exponentially large. So the takeaway from this slide is there was a higher speed up with an increased distance between the previously learned class and new item. So then we wanted to sort of take this one step ahead in the paper, and explore like what happens when you train a network on sort of multimodal data set. So over here is a similarity matrix when the network was trained on fashion MNIST data set, which is all these apparels and footwear, and then the digit or the MNIST data set with all these digit images going from 0 to 9. And then we presented the network with the boot class. Obviously, that boot class image has higher similarity with sneaker and sandal, and less with the other digits, and more with some of the apparel. So on the bottom row is basically what was the distribution of, so the similarity weighted thing. In red, you can see we have a lot of new class image being presented, and then many more of sandals and sneakers, and then many more of other fashion apparel, and then fewer item presentation of the digit class. And when we did that, we got similar result where SWIL allows learning new information pretty much as similar accuracy as fully interleaved learning. But again, this curve is presented where performance is presented as a function of learning epoch. But when you scale it according to the number of items presented, which was 350 compared to whatever 114,000 for the fully interleaved learning, you can see the massive speed up, which is of the order of 300 and so on. So there was this increased speed up and reduced memory demand during new class learning for this sort of multimodal data set, which sort of hints as an exponential speed up in real brain. And I would sort of stop here for most of my computational work where, SWIL allows learning new items. So the take home message is SWIL allows learning new item rapidly without forgetting the previously learned classes while using substantially less data. The performance achieved is similar to using the entire data or the joint replay, which was our best control condition. SWIL overcomes the challenges which was presented by both partial interleave learning or PIL or the equally weighted interleave learning. Uh, and then the speed up increased roughly in proportion to the number of non-overlapping classes stored in the network. Uh, and that was a beautiful result for us when it comes to neuroscience and to taking these experiments in real brain. So, and another thing, and this is something we are exploring right now, how SWIL is sort of complementary to many of the generative replay approaches where you can reduce the memory demand significantly by rather than, so the way we ran these tests, we actually had to store the old class images in buffer and then from there sample it. What one can do is now use sort of a generative replay approach and recreate old class images, you either using like a WAI or a GAN, um, and and then from sort of that generator sample old classes according to similarity. So the idea is that this approach can be combined with a lot of approaches, a lot of other continual learning approaches in the field, and I would be really happy to sort of collaborate on integrating SWIL with many of these other approaches. Okay, so now let's talk about the second part of the uh, talk, where how do we go on testing this sort of similarity weighted interleave learning in real brains. So as I said earlier, one of the ideas that was shown in the field and is very established now is, imagine you have a rodent which is running on a linear track, it's running back and forth, um, and you get these sort of you get these sequence of neurons firing. So there's this dark green neuron, orange neuron, red, and then blue, and they nicely cover this track, forming a neuro sequence of the linear track that the animal was running on. Then later after the task, when the animal is either in awake rest or just sitting or is actually asleep, you see these bursts of activity, which are typically of the order of 200 milliseconds, where you see the same neural sequences that were present during behavior being replayed, but in this time compressed fashion, right? Animal took about say 5 to 10 seconds to cover a track, and within 200 milliseconds, all of these get replayed. So it's this much faster playback of the behavior sequences. And um, so so we wanted to sort of use this idea and see whether there was some sort of a similarity weighted effect in terms of the replay dynamics in the brain of rodents. I would really recommend for everyone to go check out this paper. This came out from a lot of biologists working together and sort of coming up with how neuroscience and AI field can interact, and a lot of neuroscience ideas are sort of integrated. Um, how neuroscience and machine learning ideas can be integrated. It's a beautiful review paper. Okay, so how do we test it? We have our mice, which is sitting. So you can see our animals. We have this sort of a rig where there's a ball which is suspended. A mouse can be head face. Our animal runs on the ball, and we have these graphic tablets showing different types of context to the animals, and the animal typically gets a reward. And while the animal is doing these different types of behavior, we can record from their brain. So how do we do the recording? We use the silicon probe arrays. So you can think of this silicon probe where basically you have these multiple contact points that span the so we lower the silicon probe arrays in the brain of the animals while they're running actively. These probes allow us to record electrical activities or activity from single neurons. And at a time, I can record from anything, anywhere about 100 to 500 of these neurons. So here is a recording where in my recordings, I typically record from visual cortex. So as you can see, these probes then go inside the brain. This is just a section of a brain. It's just an example showing how I'm lowering my probes in the primary visual cortex. Uh, so we've got the neocortex part, and then I also record, I have a different configuration of probe that go in the hippocampus. So at the same time, I can record from the hippocampus and the visual cortex while animal is running in these different types of virtual reality context. So how do we test it in real brain? Now, what I do is typically I take my animals and I train them to run in two different contexts, which are shown here in on the left hand side. One is context B and then context A. And it takes about 3 weeks for the animal to run in these, learn to run in these contexts and lick for reward. And once that is gone, I present the animal with a text, with sort of a test context, which is novel, they've never seen. And this novel context has more similarity with one of them. So there's a similar familiar context and has less similarity with the other one, which is the different familiar context. Let me play the video and so that it's clearly apparent. And you can see how a lot of the visual textures on between the novel context and the similar familiar context are are comparable. So this allows me to sort of bias the activity in the brain um, towards like uh, towards one context as compared to the other context. So here is our hypothesis. What we are expecting to see is when you put the animal in this novel context, you see a replay of novel context sequences, which would then lead to a preferential replay of sequences from the similar familiar context than the different familiar context. Just to sort of give a more brief design on the experimental, just to give a more idea on the experiment design. Again, we take the animal, we train them in context B and context A, then we present them with a novel context, which is A prime over here. So the training happens, you present, the animal is presented A, B in an interleave fashion. And then on the test day, the novel context is being presented along with the similar familiar and the different familiar context. And I'm looking at these rest periods. Either it could be an awake rest where the animal gets a reward or just slows down uh, to see what kind of neural sequences are being replayed in the hippocampus and the visual cortex of the animal. So here are some examples of the single neuron activity that you see for different types of context in hippocampus. So each row is an individual neuron recorded in the hippocampus. What you see is on the y-axis is number of laps, and on the x-axis is the position. So the track that the animal was running was about 312 centimeter long. And as you can see in hippocampus, this neuron fires at this location 230. Across all labs, it's firing at that location. For context A, it fires at 156 centimeter location. In context A prime, the novel context, it's firing at somewhere a little bit less, maybe 130 centimeter and so on. Another neuron that's active at the start for both context A and context A prime. And then the third neuron, which is again active at exactly similar location for context A and A prime. So there is some similarity that you can already notice in the representation of these individual neurons across the similar familiar context, which was our context A, and the novel context. Same thing one can do for visual cortex neurons. Again, you have each row is individual neuron recorded from primary visual cortex. You can see there's a lot of overlap between the representation of context A and context A prime. Same thing here, this neuron, it fires at pretty much similar location between A and A prime, but a very different location. So next thing one can do is, what is the similarity as at a population level? So we are recording from about hundreds of neuron at a time from both hippocampus and visual cortex. So what's the similarity between the representation of all these contexts? So when you do sort of correlation coefficient, what you notice is there is an increased similarity between the similar familiar context and the novel context. So the red marks the similarity between similar familiar context and the novel context, and it's much more in hippocampus. And so the similar familiar context and novel context are being considered more similar in hippocampus and visual cortex, but obviously cortex is there is a sort of a gradient in the sense that there is a higher correlation in visual cortex neuron representation than the hippocampus. So, so this was at a behavior level. When the animal was actively running, we noticed a clear gradient in the representation of similar context and the novel context. But what's happening in these rest period when you get those replay event? So what we do is, so these are the rest period. What one can do is you take these rest period and you can divide them into 15 millis. You can divide them into smaller bins, say 20 millisecond bin. What one can ask is, given an activity pattern in this bin, what was, you can sort of use the Bayesian theorem and ask what was the probability of animal occupying a certain position given this probability of spiking. And when you do this Bayesian decoding, what one can find is this sort of a matrix where you can see what's the probability of occupying a certain position as a function of time. So given this sort of spiking pattern, and over here, what I've shown is, say this was about a 200 millisecond long replay event, and in each of these time bin, um, what was the probability of animal occupying? So in first 10 millisecond or 20 millisecond, you can see the Bayesian decoder said the animal was at location 62 centimeter. In the second bin, the animal went, the decoder said that the animal is at location 100 centimeter. And at later bin, so this is what I would call a forward replay, where the animal was actually sitting at this cross mark and it replayed a trajectory that of a future sequence that it will run. So this is sort of a forward replay, and our Bayesian decoder is nicely capturing that. And at the same time, um, you can have something called as a reverse replay, where the animal is sitting at a location 260 over here, and it replays um, the trajectory which is reversed, in the sense it kind of goes backward. So it's as if the animal is replaying, oh, I came from this location. Now what you can do is you can take this Bayesian decoder and apply the decoding on individual replay event and ask whether there is a preferential replay of similar familiar context or a different familiar context. What kind of replay dynamics do we see? So when we apply this a decoder, we see all kind of events. We have a forward replay of the exact same context that the animal was in. Uh, we see reverse replay of this context that the animal was in. And then there is something called as remote replay, where the animal could be actually running or just sitting while in the novel context, but it might replay an information about something else. So you can think of that as you sitting in your room, but replaying information about, say, your lab space or your or a park somewhere outside. So that is what we call remote replay. Now, um, so this is sort of just statistics on the kind of replay dynamics we see in individual contexts. As I said, local replay means replay of the context that the animal is in, and then remote replay refers to the replay of a context that's different from the context that the animal was in. And we sort of see a comparable number of local and remote replay event when the animal was either in different familiar contexts, which is shown in pink, or similar familiar context, or a novel context. But now the interesting part, and this was the key, remember our hypothesis was whenever there is a replay of novel context, there is going to be a bias towards replay of similar familiar context. Then that so there will be a bias towards the more similar context replay than the different familiar context replay. So when we look at these remote replay event, specifically when the animal was present, was active, was the specifically when the animal was sitting in the novel context, you can see there was a clear bias towards the green, which is a similar familiar context, then towards the different familiar context. So that sort of gives a hint towards that yes, even in brain, if you look at it in hippocampus and visual cortex interaction, there's a preferential replay of similar familiar context during these replay event, um, and that wasn't the case for many of our other, that wasn't observed for a different familiar context, and so on. So that sort of is a beautiful result, indicating that yes, SWIL might work in real brain, and that's something that happens um, at an actual at a physiological level. So with that, I would like to stop, and the take-home message from the second part of the talk was there's a preferential replay of sequences from old context, and it's based on similarity with the new context. And this effect was true in the case of mostly awake replay. So the replay part that I talked about mostly was when the animal was sort of awake but sitting, and it still hasn't been tested, and I'm still running those data analysis when the animal is actually in slow wave sleep, which is when people have shown a lot of replay studies are focused on slow wave sleep, or the non-REM sleep as it's called for some of the human work. So very I would that's like the next step for me. And another thing I'm really interested in sort of thinking about is what kind of similarity function are being used in real brain, because it's a very tricky concept to define similarity. Like, is the similarity at a single, at a popular, so is there should I compute similarity at the level of hippocampus? Do I compute similarity at the level of visual cortex? Do we compute similarity after recording from a bunch of brain regions and then pooling them and then seeing? So uh, I would really appreciate a discussion on that if anyone has any comments or suggestions for that. And with that, I would like to thank you. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Great. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. Now it is time for question and discussion. So if anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question, now would be the time to do it. If you are watching and following on YouTube, please just put your question there and I will relay it.
Mm-hmm.
I will start off with a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the first part of your presentation, which I'm probably more inclined to talk about with my experience,
Mm-hmm.
one, I'll say it's a very really deeply matches some intuitions I've had, and I found the results very promising.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned at the end, you talk about generative replay, how, hey, can we combine this with generative replay in some way? So
Right.
here's a question I have.
Mhm.
So if I'm correct, the way you're measuring similarity in these experiments is with like a confusion matrix. Was that correct?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, how, would it be for a generator, like in generative replay and continual learning, a lot of times all you're doing is you're moving the forgetting problem from the classifier, from the discriminative model into the generative model. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, and you may not be able to answer yet, but like, will the same conclusions, so like, will things that are similar in the discriminative model also have the same, like, will that just translate completely over to the generator where the things that you found similar with a classifier are those the same ones that have the same like one-to-one connection with what's going to have
Happen.
conflict in the generative model. And you may not be able to comment on that, but to be if you have any like
Yeah.
speculations.
So I think I've run some tests on that, and my intuition so far is it will translate nicely. But as you know, I mean, the problem with generative approaches is you're kind of shifting the entire problem to the generator, and
Right.
how the network was trained and everything can really change on what kind of generator was used. But there's this beautiful work from Andreas Stolius's lab where they use these ways and the variational autoencoder, and at least there I whatever I've noticed, there is some the transfer is very similar in the sense that the confusion by the generator kind of matches. And there's this another algorithm called sleep replay algorithm from one of our collaborators at UCSD, Maxime Bajanov's group, that also relies on using the weights of the network to recreate the old items, and they also notice a similar
Mm,
thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
I
yeah.
th yeah, I think that kind of matches also. I mean, maybe not, I could be spitballing here, but some of the like I think some of the experiments you had in the second part, may provide more intuitive evidence that there could be some connection there.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, right, there is all these differences in the representation that we're already seeing at the level of visual cortex and hippocampus and so on. So might be nice to see how different brain regions. So this was a very visual task, and I can imagine visual
Right.
cortex having. So there might be a nice gradient of differences if I were to record from, say, the auditory cortex, sounds and odor. Maybe the differences are not there, and is the SWIL effect true for, say, olfactory cortex and so on. So that's another thing we're planning on doing in future.
Great. Um, are there any other questions? I do have another one. I don't see any hands raised. So this is more of this may be kind of going to your future work, so you don't have to give
Mhm.
anything away if you don't want to, but
That's okay.
how would you determine similarity without a confusion matrix? So for example, like when now we say, let's say we want to take these and we want to like explore it more,
Mhm.
like the confusion matrix seems kind of like using something like forward looking in a way. So would
Right, right. Yeah. So I can give you a little bit of intuition from a neuroscience perspective where this thing first originated. So we were using these continuous attractor network or field network, if you're aware of those. And the way at least we set out that we think it's happening in the brain, and we can talk more about it, is imagine you have this is your landscape or your brain, the square box, and you have all these different categories shown in different these steel colored shape, and then you get a novel input which is shown here in blue, and that input overlaps with a bunch of um, old classes. So you have 100 neurons being activated for the novel input, and these neurons are also part of the previously learned classes, right? So this sort of allows the new information to leave an excitability trace or an eligibility trace, as some of the machine learning field people call it. Uh, and what that does is it kind of increases the excitability of the neurons that were part of the overlapping categories. And later in sleep, even a small noisy perturbation would trigger a replay of new memory. But then, because these overlapping neurons are also being excited, they will kind of get also replayed spontaneously because they're sitting so close to the baseline, and then you would get a sort of pattern completion. So the neuron with the maximum amount of the category with the maximum overlap might get replayed more than the next one, and so on. So you might get the similarity weighted effect because of this sort of overlap. uh, and later on, you might have some sort of a competitive learning rule, either spike time dependent plasticity and so on, that will allow you to learn new information and maybe change the previously learned information a little bit fashion. So this is sort of an unsupervised way where just by the
mm,
basis of how the excitability trace or eligibility trace was set up, um, um, the brain is spontaneously retrieving which old memories to replay. So for neural network, I mean, one way to think about that would be looking at sort of the weights of the just an unsupervised function would be something like um, looking at the, as soon as you get a novel input, looking at the kind of like the overlapping neurons with increased weight and seeing if just interleaving them causes um, allows you to overcome forgetting. I don't know if that helped, but
no,
yeah.
no, no, absolutely. I think this whole yeah. I mean, honestly, just looking at this diagram kind of paints the whole picture immediately as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something we are actually um, sort of working on right now, and I actually have a sort of I'm presenting in one of the conferences this attractor network model. So yeah.
My last question for you, this is a very important question that I was wondering through a lot of your presentation.
Mhm.
Could Watson fit into any of your animal recording hardware? He's about 32
uh,
pounds. I've always wanted to know, when he's asleep and he's twitching, what's going on in there? What's he replaying? It's a driving
uh,
fact for my research. So, Do you think it could
Well,
fit, or does it need to be mouse size?
well, technically, people do primate research, right? Although I wouldn't want to record from Watson because that actually means opening up the brain and putting the
Oh,
wires
oh,
in
no, no,
there.
no. Okay, yeah, we're not gonna do that.
Yeah, so we don't want to do that. But yeah, people actually like primate researchers, right? There have been the exact same probes have been people are now using them to record from freely moving macaques. If you've seen, Neuralink actually had I think last year they had a
Hmm.
presentation where they showed recording from I think pigs, I want to say. Um, so so yeah, and even these similar recordings have been done in humans, although mostly they're like uh, s- um, um, sub epilepsy subjects and so on, and they're in there for already a medical reason. So and
Right.
then uh, so yeah, these recordings can actually be done, and a lot of these results translate really well across species,
Hmm.
which is good for us
Yeah, yeah.
who are doing mouse research.
Awesome. I'm sure if I
Uh,
offered him enough greenies, he would volunteer to do it, but I'm not gonna let him. I'm not gonna let him. Okay.
we can make a custom, we can try to get someone to make a custom EEG cap for
There we
him
go.
and get
Um,
some at least sleep signals.
yeah. So someone asked a question online, but I think this is gonna lead to one last question for you, but I'll also half answer it. So
Uh-huh.
David Gonzalez is asking, what's a good Python package for continual learning? So I'll first answer as saying there are a lot of existing packages. You can go to different people's code, see what they like, but the one that we like to push here at Continual AI, it's the Avalanche framework. It's one that has a large collaboration that many people have worked on, and I think we're in multiple versions through it now, and it's being widely adopted by many labs. So check out Avalanche. You can find that from the Continual AI website or Avalanche PyTorch. But that does bring me to another question: Is do you have any type of code available for this kind of work, or is it like release code?
Yeah, so I have to put it out on GitHub,
Yeah,
so stay tuned. Yeah,
but
I
it will.
was
Okay,
yeah, I am planning on releasing it in on my GitHub.
awesome, great. I think this is a
Great.
great presentation. Probably a good time to wrap it up now.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks,
Yeah,
James.
yeah. Thank you, Rahat. Thank you for this presentation. I thought this was so interesting, getting this other side of it. Anyone following in, you can join us next week, same time, same place. We will continue our next installment. I believe we are going to have another neuroscience perspective next week, back to back week. So make sure to join. Thank you, everybody.